Welcome back to 50 Days to Rebuild, day 3, jumping straight into what I've done today. So starting with, of course, the McGill Big 3, but really trying to focus right now on the side plank. As I discussed in the previous videos, my side plank is looking abysmal because it looks like my scapula is winging, and honestly, especially with my shirt off, just looking at the actual musculature, it looked quite terrifying. So tried to address that today by essentially doing a modification of the cue that I was talking about using for flexion. So really pushing forward and out. So same thing, but just abduction. So pushing away to the side and out. Doing this did actually feel better. Normally I've been doing essentially a bit of a scoop movement for quite a long time. And I'm seeing the potential shortcomings of that now. This did somewhat feel more stable, and maybe a little less like my shoulders cracking as much. But reviewing the footage, it looks a bit better, but it still looks like we're getting a lot of the same issues. And I did try to really focus on trying to pull with say the contralateral or ipsilateral lat to get the rotation to be smooth, but I just could not get a integrated motion. It just felt like everything was twisting one by one by one. So not loving that, but I guess, yeah, it's something else we just gotta keep trying to experiment with. Bird dogs I was actually really quite happy with. Yesterday I felt like things were improving, but today I felt like reviewing the footage and just in the movement as well, no, my arm's going directly into flexion. This doesn't really feel like there's much abduction happening. And again, I'm sort of crediting that to this cue of sort of not scooping, but really working along the edge of the range as a cycle, pushing out and forward. Still externally rotating as I do this, but that's been helpful. The main other thing that I was trying to do was just try and find some sort of serratus exercise to do. I noticed that my scapula's winging, it's coming medially, so inwards. When I've researched that, it looks like a true scapular winging they were calling a nerve injury to the long thoracic nerve. I don't know if that's what I've got going on. I also heard people arguing it doesn't have to be a nerve injury, it can just be a general dysfunction, which makes sense to me. You could just have weakness. So looked into serratus exercises, which is by no means my first time. This is something that I spent a long time trying to get right, but I actually thought I had improved a lot, but having reviewed the footage of the side plank, apparently not. And came to a Scott University video that apparently I've seen before, about trying to roll the foam roller up the wall. I have historically hated this exercise for the fact that I feel like I can't really activate the serratus properly. But also maybe I wasn't following the cueing properly, because I was following the cue this time from Dr. Aaron Horshig, basically protracting, so pushing into the wall, and then trying to upwardly rotate the scapulas, and then sort of having them wrap around. This didn't feel perfect. It actually felt rather good when I wasn't following some of his cueing, particularly the vertical forearm, because getting upward rotation of the scapula, kind of similar to abduction, that was particularly tough. I don't know how to not have your forearm rotate, but my shoulder felt better having done that. So I think that was something that was very intriguing. Hey, maybe we can keep working at this range. Maybe this exercise isn't as crap as I thought it was previously. And yeah, maybe we can just follow that cueing and apply it to some other exercises and we might have some success. Jumping straight into what I learned in anatomy trains today, just want to talk about retraction, so the rhomboid action, because I've heard from physios I've asked and seen competing information when I was memorizing anatomy around retraction that it didn't involve elevation, and these guys sort of countered that as well, which makes so much sense when you look at the rhomboids and you see the orientation of fibers. But basically they're saying that when you retract, you do elevate, which was just bloody lovely to hear. I've also dealt with a lot of elbow pain, so something that I read here about the arm lines was very helpful, which is that the elbows never really bear load, or bear the majority of the load, when you're carrying weight. So say you're doing a suitcase carry, the actual load as it's progressing up the arm will be taken by the bicipital aponeurosis, the biceps aponeurosis, as opposed to going to the actual elbow. Very interesting because that ties into the biceps. At least from my perspective, that suggests that if we're encountering elbow issues, maybe part of the issue is that the bicep isn't functioning properly. So that might be something that I'd look at addressing because I've had some bicep, I think, tears when climbing. Not a full tear, but definitely some popping. So maybe addressing that, especially on my right side, might address some of these elbow and subsequent wrist issues that I encounter. Then jumping into the functional lines, there's a few here. They're quite strange, I guess. They seem like they're not very much to like a postural line. They're not like they won't be active, but it's only like a specific type of movement is when these ones would really kick in. So coming basically from like the humerus down the lat into the glutes and the vastus lateralis of the quad, being like the back line, for example, the back functional line. Then there's also the functional front line, which basically work down from the pec minor through the rectus abdominis into the adductor longus, I believe. And then finally the ipsilateral functional line, working down from the lat through the external oblique and then into the sartorius, which is just this little sort of thin muscle on the inside of the leg next to the adductors. Frankly, there wasn't actually too much covered about the functional lines. I guess the most interesting part was really around throwing injuries. And I believe it was the back functional line. If that's not functioning properly, both in terms of its strength and its timing to work as a brake system, then we're going to continuously get injuries around like the rotacuff and like slap tears, for example. So like the superior labrum. That's interesting. I've definitely hurt myself throwing and have lots of rotacuff issues. And essentially they're arguing that if you don't work that line and you rely on training, like say just the rotacuff muscles, you're putting way too much demand on the rotacuff when it actually needs more of a, I guess like an integrated approach for it to function correctly. Moving on to the deep front line, and I think this is definitely the coolest one I've encountered so far because it's essentially the core. So it's working up from the underside of the toes up through the tibialis posterior, which is like this exceptionally deep like calf muscle basically, then up through the adductors into the psoas and iliacus, and into the diaphragm, and they really emphasize that this is like a very 3D line. It's actually like rather difficult to conceptualize it, even though none of them are 2D technically. Like this one is more expansive, especially like in the thorax, because it starts to cover some of the fascia around some of the organs, like the heart and the lungs, eventually covering like the hyoid muscles, the mandible, some of the cervical spine, and a bit of the skull itself. I think this is probably the most intriguing of the lines. Just I think that any type of like idiopathic injury, so like where we don't know the cause, which was definitely the case in my like initial injury process. So the argument that the author made here is that, well, sort of two things. So one is that this deep front line, it doesn't exclusively control every movement or any movement, but it's essentially involved in every movement, right? Hence like the idea of being the core as well as being the deepest part. And that if we get an issue in this deep front line, this DFL, that it might not be an instant or obvious dysfunction. It's just going to be like a slight lack of grace. And that these other lines, they're going to find a way to function, right? It's going to be somewhat okay, but again, it's that lack of grace and then sort of setting the prerequisite for sort of poor joint kinematics, like poor joint movement, muscle movement, so that we might start to degrade over time and perhaps set the foundation a bit shakily so that things will go poorly in the future. If we tie this in with the ideas discussed previously around dealing with the band-aid issue first prior to the core predisposing issue, I guess what this suggests is that the DFL shouldn't be targeted first. That we should actually try and address some of those other compensatory mechanisms and the other lines of action, and then look at attacking the DFL I think this is quite a hopeful thing because sometimes I'll mobilize some form of tissue, right? Like say my quads. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, kind of almost feels like I get more like, say, hip extension. And then you sort of lose that. You sort of feel like you've taken a step in the right direction, but there's not a nail in the coffin. Like this hasn't really worked. And I guess this sort of suggests like, yeah, it's because you haven't then attacked the DFL. Also, this chapter provided some clarity around the different lines functioning and playing into different compensations in different ways. So it talked about this deep front line and then the lateral line in valgus knees. So the DFL and the lateral line in the case of valgus knees are essentially acting as like a bow and a bowstring to each other. They sort of share that relationship where if we had valgus knees, the lateral surfaces would essentially be locked short and the medial surfaces of the deep front line would be locked long, so an eccentric contraction. I guess what's intriguing here though is I feel like I've encountered somewhat of a contradiction, or maybe just something I don't understand, where they're saying that the strained side is normally the painful side, so the eccentric side is normally the painful side, but that you should target the one that's not strained. Whereas I felt like earlier they were saying target the eccentric side. So I guess there's a bit of confusion around what to target here, but still good to see the balancing between these lines. Final thing, just to wrap up, just from a purely anatomical nerd perspective, talking about the psoas minor, which is present in, I believe, 51% of people. But it's a fascial band in the other 49%. I thought that's a really important distinction. When I was learning anatomy, normally it was, oh, this is just present in this percentage of people, and that was kind of mind-boggling. I'm like, what? So half or more of us just don't have this muscle? Like, when I was learning about the biceps, like they were arguing in Grey's Anatomy that there were some cases of people having like 7 heads of the biceps, and it's like, what do you mean? Like, A, I gotta know how to conceptualize that, and B, like, how is that absent on other people? But when we're potentially saying, like, it's not like an entire structure is missing, it's just represented differently, like fascia instead of, like, muscle tissue. And that makes a lot more sense that, yes, we're gonna get some differences in the anatomy, but it's not going to be, entire muscles missing. They might just be represented differently. Anyway, that's just my little nerd thing to go down. That is day 3 all wrapped up. I will see you tomorrow.